Well, I see Brother Yoon on the front row here, and when I see him, it's always very special for me because I saw his face a lot when I was in prison. I had a picture of him that I put next to my bed, and I would look at it many times a day just to draw inspiration. Here's someone who was faithful and who suffered before I did, and I thought if he remained faithful, then I should be able to remain. There's a lot of echo on this, so yeah. If he remained faithful, then I should be able to remain faithful. My wife and I were in Turkey for 25 years as missionaries, and the last 2 of those I spent in Turkish prison. I was accused of being a spy and a terrorist. I was falsely accused, let me underline falsely. And they also said I was the head of the CIA for the Middle East and all kinds of interesting things like that. But then I thought it was interesting. After I left Turkey, I met 2 former CIA directors, and they must have been wondering about that. But it's not true. It's not true. Anyway, I had a picture of Brother Yoon next to my bed. I looked at it many times. Also a picture of Richard Wurmbrandt, a Romanian pastor who had suffered persecution for many years, has been in prison. And I looked to those who had gone before me. I had read Brother Yoon's book, Heavenly Man. So Brother Yoon is in prison, and in a cell next to him is Peter Shu, who's also here, Uncle Peter. And Peter says to Yoon one day, Yoon's legs are not working, they've been damaged, injured severely, but he says, God is saying get up and go. And Yoon was also sensing that at the time. This was a confirmation, and so he walks out of that prison. No one had ever escaped from that prison before, and he just walks through the doors. It's a really amazing story, kind of like Peter in the Bible. Of course, it's an amazing story, and it's really encouraging when we hear how he walks out of this high-security Chinese prison. Wow, God is so powerful, right? And then I thought of Peter, who stayed behind. Because, God supernaturally called Yoon out of that prison, and then he got out of China with a passport. He was telling me just in the back how, Yoon has a lot of hair, and the passport, the guy is bald. It wasn't Yoon's passport. And the guy, the security person, at passport control is looking, this is not the same person, but he let him through. So this was God arranging all of this. It's an amazing story. It's really encouraging. But see, I always thought about Uncle Peter, who gets to stay behind in prison. And if you read that story, he was then tortured. He was strung between 2 doors and just stretched apart. Felt like he could understand what it was like to be on a cross. So there's Brother Yoon, who of course suffered a great deal for the Lord, but is able to escape miraculously. And there's Uncle Peter, who gets to stay behind and be tortured. I often wrote to my wife, a different Peter, the Apostle Peter. You have Peter and James in prison, and James is killed, and Peter miraculously escapes the same way you did. He just walks out through the doors. And I wrote to my wife many times, am I Peter or am I James? I don't know. Nobody knows. When we go into persecution, there are no guaranteed results. We don't know what will happen. We often think of persecution. We're celebrating, we're honoring Chinese brothers, we're honoring Iranian brothers and others who have suffered for the Lord in other countries. But I think that we're coming into a period in this country where we're going to face persecution. My parents live in Black Mountain, which you all who are from North Carolina know that there were devastating floods in that area. And if you live in the mountains of North Carolina, you just don't think about, hurricanes very much. It's not something that is on our radar. But then suddenly in comes this hurricane, these tremendous, these floods that people have not expected at all, and it just wipes entire towns out. And I think this is kind of a picture of what we are facing in the United States. I think there's a great storm on the horizon. There is a wave of hostility and persecution that's about to crash onto the church. And most of us are not aware of it. We don't expect it because we haven't really experienced it in the past in our country in any severe sense. And I don't think that we're going to look like China or like North Korea or like Iran. The pressure that we're going to face is going to be enough to knock a lot of people out. Yeah. You know, I've thought about the Middle East since I've lived there for many years, and we're still involved there. We're still missionaries in that part of the world. And, you know, the Middle East used to be majority Christian. And then Islam came and engulfed that area. And many people were killed for their faith. Many others converted because of the fear of the sword. But the majority who ended up sliding away from Christianity. It wasn't just, oh, they're going to kill me, so, you know, I'm afraid of the sword, and so I'm going to convert. No, it was over a period of decades, and it happened because of social pressure and financial pressure. The social pressure is that people were looked down on. They were despised. They were seen as second class, not even citizens, but second class. They had to wear clothes that were different colors to distinguish them as not being Muslims. They were allowed to ride donkeys, but they were not allowed to ride a horse, for example. So all of this was intended to demean people. Didn't have legal standing the way a Muslim would. So this continual social ostracization, this marginalizing, being despised and looked down on. And then there was also a heavy tax if you were not a Muslim. So all of these Christians, many of them are just trying to get by, and over time, that heavy tax for not being a Muslim, it just wears them down. And then some of them just start to slide off because of the social and financial pressure. And that's where the majority of them who ended up leaving Christianity, you have a majority Christian area that ends up becoming overwhelmingly Muslim over time. Now, some endured for centuries. I really honor the historically Christian church there, even if many of them are not born again. They've maintained that identity even in the face of pressure. But most didn't. And so that was mainly not fear of the sword, not fear of prison. It was the social and financial pressure. And so that's enough to knock a lot of people out. And I think that's what's coming to our country. I think that we're going to be known as a people of hate, because if you say what God says, and this is what we need to commit ourselves to doing. If God says, Jesus is the only way to salvation, I need to say that He is. If God says something is good, I need to say it's good. If God says something is sin, then I have to say that it's sin as well. And if you live as a faithful disciple of Jesus in this generation and in the one coming, and you say what He says, even if you're not out actively speaking to people and challenging them with your views, just living a quiet life as a believer, you will be forced to celebrate things that you cannot celebrate, things that God calls sin. And you will be put in a position, most of us will be, to choose to identify with Jesus or not to. And we will be called, I think, a people of hate. And this is going to be very difficult, and it's going to bring financial pressure as well. But we need to prepare ourselves ahead of time so that we can face these pressures. And we need to adjust to living as a minority. I think we cannot vote ourselves out of this because all of our institutions have changed. The whole culture has changed. And so we cannot vote ourselves out of this. We cannot pray it away. When I'm around people who are Holy Spirit oriented, which maybe I don't know how many of you are, but there's a revival coming. I say, yes, may a revival come. But you know what? It can happen in very difficult circumstances. People tend to think, oh, the move of God, He's going to move, there's going to be revival. And they don't think about the darkness that it can happen in. But that's what was happening in the early church, right? There was a lot of pressure, and yet the church was growing. That's what happened in China. There was a lot of pressure, and the church grew. And there was revival. I actually think there's going to be an exodus from the church. I don't think we're going to grow. I think we're going to get smaller before we grow. Because the pressure is going to come. A lot of people are going to leave who don't want to pay the cost. And there is going to be a purification of the bride. There's going to be a bride who's very devoted and loving and faithful and is in the dark. And then people will begin, in their hopelessness and the darkness that's coming to our land, they will become attracted to the church again. But first there's a purifying fire before there's that revival fire. So even if you're looking at what God is doing and have those high expectations of we're going to tear the walls down and great things are going to happen, Prepare yourself for difficulty, because I think that's going to be happening parallel at the same time. So anyway, we need to prepare ourselves to be a despised minority. And I think persecution is going to increase. There's a video series called Prepare to Stand. I recorded it with Samaritan's Purse. So I recommend, you can find it free online, just Andrew Brunson, Prepare to Stand. And that will go through some of the things that I learned in prison. I had to learn to strengthen myself in my brokenness to remain faithful. And that can be a help to some of you. I think some of the things I learned, I think, can be helpful to you. But I don't want to focus on that today. That's why it's recorded, so that people can go watch that. But what best prepared me for what I faced in prison was building intimacy with God over a number of years, building a love for Him, because it's love that makes us willing to suffer. Love drives our faithfulness. It fuels our perseverance, our endurance. So that's what best prepared me. The greatest danger that I faced in prison spiritually in my walk with God was my offended heart. I was deeply wounded toward God, because after pursuing Him for many years and having encounters with Him and experiencing His presence many times. What did I say? Anyway, after pursuing for many years and focusing on presence, when I was put into solitary confinement, I said, God, as long as I have your presence, I can do anything. And then I lost, all of you are nodding yes. Then I lost all sense of His presence for the remainder of for the 2 years I was in prison. And that took me into crisis. Like, I felt abandoned by God. I had no sense of presence, no sense of His voice. I felt very much in the dark. And for, people like many of you who are Holy Spirit oriented, who've had encounters with God and who've pursued Him, it can be very difficult because your expectations are higher. You expect more from Him. And I had high expectations from God, and He didn't meet those. He didn't. I'm just being honest about it. And so my heart was deeply wounded and offended toward Him. And that's what almost knocked me out. I began to question God's existence. I accused Him of His character of many things. I'm not offended anymore. Just in case you're wondering, no. But that almost knocked me out. And I think that's going to be one of the great dangers that you're going to face, that many of you will face, especially if you've had experiences of God, is when you're thrust into darkness. When the feelings are gone, then what do you do? Anyway, I'm not going to talk about that today, because what I want to talk about is what I was most missing. I've told you what I had that took me through, which was the love. That even when everything was stripped away, there was still that core of love inside of me that held on to God, even when I was very disillusioned and disappointed and very confused. And then there was that danger I mentioned of the offended heart. But I want to talk about what I was most missing. And what I was most missing was right perspective. Part of that came from other persecution stories that I had read, that if some people had been more transparent, that would have been very helpful to me, because, I thought, hey, someone sent me a message early on in my time in solitary confinement, Andrew, it's going to be great. It's just you and God now. It's going to be awesome. I'm like, no, it isn't. But that's the way we think often, is because the stories of persecution often are just of great victory, and we don't see the struggle, the internal struggle that people go through. So I want to talk about what I was most missing, which was that sense of perspective, and especially fear, because I'm a world-class expert on fear. Very few people have been as afraid as I have been. We were at a conference in Germany, and someone was explaining to us how ChatGPT is going to be very helpful in the future to everyone, AI. And so they made a query of this ChatGPT. What does the Bible say about courage? And so ChatGPT, goes through all of the commentaries and the sermons out there, and it gave a very good, like a study of what does the Bible say about courage. And it said, courage is fearless, being without fear. And I immediately thought, ChatGPT got this wrong. Of course, it populated this answer from what Christians are saying. But, I remember when ISIS attacked the Kurds and on the border with Turkey, Noreen and I went out there, and we could hear the bombs going off, we could hear small arms fire, and she was afraid to go out there. We were told, don't come out here, it's Americans, it's dangerous for you. But she went out anyway, even though she was afraid. Then we'd go back to Izmir, where we lived in western Turkey. Oh, it's good to be back, where it's a little bit safer. But she'd go out again, even though she was afraid. And she'll tell you she's a fearful person. But see, I think that's courage. It's when she goes out because of her obedience. She wants to obey in spite of her fear. So I think courage isn't the absence of fear. It's obeying when you are afraid. I heard Mike Bickle said to me once, he said, we prepare ahead of time so we're not afraid. And I said, Mike, speak for yourself. I prepare ahead of time so that when I am afraid, I don't run, but I stand. Because I think it's normal to be afraid. We admire physical courage. We admire someone who's going to run into the burning building or someone who shows heroism in war. But this is often without thought. It tends to be impulsive. And most of us are going to be faced with a different demand on our courage. Think of a person who knows the possible consequences of obeying God and then steels himself and takes a stand and then remains faithful when he starts to experience those consequences and continues to do this over a long period of time. Is paying a price. That requires a very different kind of courage, a deliberate, calculated, and long-term courage. And it's more difficult in many ways than that impulsive courage that we admire of the man who runs into the building but hasn't really thought about it very much. So we need to cultivate courage. We need to learn to overcome fear because persecution can be more difficult than we expect. I think people often have an unwarranted sense of confidence, kind of like, bring it on. It's going to make us grow. Look at the church in China, how it grew under pressure. I say, yes, I know. But I remind you of the church in the Middle East, which was almost silenced. It can be very dangerous. I think of Uncle Peter. I don't know how much of his story he's telling, but he endured tremendous hardship. And I know his son also went through hardship. But not everyone in the family followed Jesus. Some of them slid away. And you think, here's one family, they're facing the same persecution, but they have very different results. So persecution brings us to a point of crisis, and it can drive you toward God. It can also drive you away from Him. It's dangerous. And that's why when Jesus talks about persecution, He always warns about the dangers. Not everyone makes it through. And in hindsight, I think what would have helped me was to know how difficult it can be. From some of the biographies I'd read, as I said, I didn't see the internal struggles. And people can think, it's just glorious to suffer for Jesus. And it absolutely is. It's going to be greatly rewarded. But, even if it's here, if it's only enduring financial pressure, what if you lose your job? You think, this is amazing. I'm suffering for Jesus. Yes, but you may have long-term consequences, and your loved ones may have long-term consequences that you may pay a price for a long time. And you'll be rewarded in heaven, but maybe nothing's going to change here. You may suffer here for a long time. So, yes, it's rewarded, but it can be very difficult. And even if the extent is only to be humiliated and hated and despised and thought of as evil, that can also be very difficult. Let me see what I want to skip over. I can keep talking about the difficulties of persecution. Just take my word for it, it's difficult. Courage does not come naturally, but courage is something that we can develop. People do this in the military. They prepare a soldier so that he's conditioned so that when there is that adrenaline rush and there is that fear, they still do what they're supposed to do. So they respond in the correct way, even when they are afraid. So this is something that's drilled into them. They don't say you're going to be fearless. So no, when you are afraid, you discipline yourself so that you give the right response. So I understand fear. I was separated from my family. I was locked away with no control over anything by a government that's very hostile to Christians. And I also had the threat of, I was in prison for 2 years, but I had 3 life sentences hanging over me. So if I'd known it was going to be 2 years, I could have counted the days down. I still would have broken, but it would have been a lot easier. But I did not know I was going to get out of prison, that I would see my wife and children again, until the day that I got out. So I lived with those 2 years were just the uncertainty and the fear of having 3 life sentences hanging over me. And because of this fear, lots of adrenaline, lots of stress hormones are released. I'm overwhelmed with this fear over time. I won't take you through the whole physical side of how this works, but basically I end up having waves and waves of panic attacks because the body's natural tranquilizers have been canceled out by all of the stress hormones. So wave after wave of panic attack, and when you put panic together with despair, that's very dangerous. That's when people commit suicide. So Jesus repeatedly warns his disciples that they're going to encounter persecution and hardship, and then he admonishes them not to fear. But how do you avoid fear? Because I'm afraid when there's a threat, it's natural, my heart's going to start beating faster, and the adrenaline is going to start shooting through my body. And actually, brain science is showing now that there are certain emotions that are hardwired into our brain. That means they're there. You can't get rid of them. And each of them has a negative side. It also has a positive side. Think of anger. Anger can be very destructive. Anger is also something that can be good when you're angry at an injustice, and that anger then motivates you to go and do something about it. So it can be good or bad. Fear is the same way. Fear is hardwired into our brains. We cannot get rid of it. You can use all the spiritual disciplines you want. Your body is still, it's hardwired into your brain. It's there. But fear can be very negative. It can also be positive. If you have no fear, you're probably going to die very young. You're going to do stupid things because fear is intended to keep you from taking excessive risks. So it can be healthy. It can also be very negative. It can dominate us. So when Jesus says, do not fear, I don't think he's talking about the emotion of fear, which we cannot get rid of anyway. He's talking about don't make your decisions out of fear. Obey in spite of fear. Okay? He's not talking about the emotion. I'm going to have no fear. I'm just going to be overwhelmed with peace. We just sang this morning, when praise rises, the fear runs away. It really doesn't. The perspective can change. It doesn't mean the emotion is gone. So the danger is if you surrender to that fear, if you make your decisions out of that fear, that you can end up compromising. So in my case, if someone had opened the doors up early on and said, Andrew, you can leave the prison, and God says, Andrew, I want you to stay here. I like to think that I would have stayed, but it's very likely I would have run out the doors. I would have done what Jonah did and just ran away. Why? Because I was so overwhelmed with fear. And it took me months. It took me about a year to get to the point where I would have stayed, I think. It took me about a year to come to the point where I could stand firm in spite of fear. I didn't stop being afraid. I had fear the entire time. But I came to a point where I could stand in spite of my fear, and I think that's what I would call overcoming fear. And so I want to share with you how I came to that point, because it may be helpful to you as you face difficulties in the future and this dark wave that is coming. So the first thing in changing my perspective is I started to ask for a fear of God. We need to nurture a straight up fear of God as judge. And there are some things that stood out to me as never before as I read the Bible in a Turkish prison. And one was a large number of exhortations to persevere, to endure, to overcome, and the consequences of not doing so. And these were hard words for me, especially they were sobering to me, because I wasn't sure that I could endure or be faithful. I felt very weak and broken. So we rightly emphasize the love of God, but we don't like to talk a lot about hell or judgment in our churches generally. And yet Jesus talked about it quite a bit. And he did this because there are terrible consequences to denying him, to compromising our faith. And Jesus said it very clearly and bluntly. He says, do not fear those who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in hell. So this isn't empty rhetoric. Jesus is telling this to his disciples. And he's warning them and he's preparing them because his closest disciples, this is who he said that to, that warning. They were going to face tremendous difficulties. They were going to face hard choices. And in the end, most of them were faced with, with a very difficult choice. Are you going to follow Jesus or are you willing to die? And most of them were killed because when it came to that point, they made that choice, And so they remain loyal to Jesus. And so there's a healthy fear of God. It's a fear that God wants us to have because it encourages loyalty to him. And as I said, those were hard verses to read, especially when I'm feeling very weak, but they also help to build a resolve in me. I have to remain faithful. I have to remain faithful, even if I'm overcome with fear. I have to, because the consequences of not doing so are terrible. So at its most basic, the question for us is, well, am I going to have more fear of man or more fear of God? And in our context today, what we're heading into, Jesus might say, do not fear those who can cancel you in this life. Fear the one who can cancel you in the next. Are you going to be more afraid of the consequences of obeying God? What are the consequences of obeying God? It's persecution. Are you going to be more afraid of the consequences of obeying God or the consequences of not obeying him, which is to stand before him as judge? So we need to have the right perspective. That although it may be costly to follow Jesus, it is much more costly not to follow him. And we need to say this. If you're leaders in a church, you need to teach this in your church, especially to the next generation, that there is judgment. Yes. And actually, God really wants to build this in us. He's promised to do this. Early on, when I had just been put in solitary confinement, and the guards didn't know that I was a high security prisoner at the time, and somehow a booklet from Mike Bickle got through to me. It was the last time something got through, and it was prayers to strengthen your inner man. And the first prayer there was, and this is how I structured my time. There's nothing to do in solitary confinement. It's just me in a bed. There's nothing to read. There's nothing to write with. It's just, I'm sitting there in my fear all alone. And I structured my day. That's what kept me from going insane, was those 10 prayers. And I structured my day around just focusing in on those prayers. And the first one was fear of God. And God said, I will put the fear of me in their hearts. He says to Israel, I'll put the fear of me in their hearts so that they do not depart from me. And so I'm saying, oh, yes, build this fear in me. From the beginning, I'm saying, build this fear in me. Put your fear in my heart so that even under the pressures, even in my confusion and in my offendedness toward you, my woundedness toward you, that I still fear you enough that I don't turn away. And the Holy Spirit is going to help to shape our minds and our hearts so that we think, so that we see and think differently. He wants to do this, and that's good news. We just have to keep asking him to do it. But he will build fear in us, the right fear. The second thing is that we need to nurture a right perspective, to develop eternal eyes. And this is what Paul says about his suffering. For our light and momentary troubles are achieving for us an eternal glory that far outweighs them all. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen, since what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal. So he has the right perspective. Paul was right. This life is very short, it's temporary, and then comes forever. And so this should put things into perspective. But see, Paul had an advantage. And I complained a lot about this, because Paul had an advantage. He encountered the resurrected Jesus in all of his glory, and it's so powerful that it knocks him to the ground. And then Paul also talks about visiting heaven. So when Paul talks about, hey, this is nothing, have the right perspective, heaven is awesome, it's amazing, he's not saying it in faith. He's saying it, he's speaking from his experience. And I complained because I said, oh God, if you would let me experience, if you would show up in my cell. I have 2 or 3 friends who've been in prison for their faith, and Jesus appeared in their cell. I said, that might make a difference when Jesus puts his hands on your face and looks into your eyes. I have one friend, I was just with him a week ago in D.C., and he was in prison and around for a few weeks, and Jesus appeared, and he tried to commit suicide, and he couldn't go through with it, and then he started talking about being enthralled with the beauty of Jesus, and I'm reading this book in prison, I'm saying, how did he do that? I'm trying. How can I be enthralled by your beauty, Jesus? It's not working for me. And then I found out, well, Jesus appeared in the cell. That might change your experience, right? And I begged and I pleaded, oh God, no one has ever asked for it more than I did, and it didn't happen. God did not give me that experience at all. And I was sure that if he did, I would just shut up. It would change my perspective. But he didn't give it to me, and I had to get it the hard way, the way that most of you are going to. And so I can tell you from experience that it's possible to develop fear of God, and it's possible to develop a heavenly perspective even in the most difficult circumstances. I was called into a court session, and I was told that new charges were being added. Now they were accusing me of helping to plan a coup against the government and all that kind of stuff. And this was going to result in 3 life sentences in solitary confinement with no possibility of parole. And so after I heard this, I was just devastated. I couldn't get out of bed for 3 days. It was a big blow. And a couple of weeks later, I was a worship leader for many years, and I'm just singing out my grief to God, my pain to him. And just as I pace back and forth, I'm talking about the loss of my family, just the terrible grief, missing my wife. And as I'm singing this, then what comes out is, you're worthy. You're worthy of whatever tears. You're worthy of whatever pain I go through. Which that kind of surprised me, but that's what came out of my mouth, out of my heart, really, the deepest part of my heart. And I kept on singing, and out of that came a heart song. It was my cry to Jesus, really a love song to him. And one verse says, I want to be found worthy to stand before you on that day with no regrets from cowardice or things left undone. And what happened is that I envisioned standing before Jesus at the end of my life and having him say to me, Andrew, there were assignments that I had for you that were left undone because you were a coward and ran away. And I had an inheritance I intended for you to win in this land, in this earth. But you didn't because, well, you were a coward. And I determined that I did not want to stand before Jesus with regrets. And this was a significant change for me because 2 or 3 months before then, I'd been at a very low point, and I said, God, I don't want to serve you anymore. I'm not turning away from Jesus. I'm not rejecting you, but I don't want to serve you. And 24 years by that time, I'd invested in that land of Turkey, and I'm saying, I don't care about that. I put it all aside. If you intend to use this in any way, I renounce it. I don't want it. I can't handle this anymore. I'm too weak and broken. Just let me go back to my family. That's all I want. I don't care if I'm the least person in the entire kingdom of heaven. It doesn't matter to me. Let me go. And this was a terrible defeat. I don't want to serve you anymore. But now, a couple months later, I'm in worse circumstances, and I'm saying the opposite. I repented, and now I decided I want to complete every single assignment God has for me, even if this means remaining in prison. Why? Because I determined that I want to live for the day that I stand before Jesus. And I sang that song every day for the rest of my imprisonment. I want to stand before you without regrets. I want to stand before you having completed every assignment that you have for me. And as I repeated it again and again, as I focused on living that day that I stand before Jesus, I'm focusing on living for eternity. Then it changed from being a declaration of intent, of what I want to do, to actually becoming the orientation of my heart. It reshaped my heart. So a fear of God and a heavenly perspective began to take shape and to grow in me. And it wasn't a feeling, it wasn't an emotion. It wasn't simply an intellectual assent to truth. There was a spiritual dimension to this. It was supernatural. God was working this in me. And the same thing happened in the third area I want to highlight, which is is building a desire for heaven. We need to nurture a desire for heaven. There's a fear of God which is healthy and good, so we avoid judgment. And then there's also the great incentive, which is heaven. And I didn't discover, I went to seminary, I did a PhD, and I didn't discover heaven until I went to prison. Somehow I went through all my studies without being aware of how amazing heaven is going to be. And one thing is, it seems so distant and, otherworldly, but actually, heaven is going to descend to earth. There's going to be continuity with so many of the things that are beautiful here. There's going to be continuity of relationships, and it's going to be amazing. I grew up in a very boring church in Mexico. My parents were missionaries there. You have the choir get up and sing, and then they say, "This is just like heaven." And I said, "Oh no, oh no." No, it's going to be amazing. I can't even be, I know some, like Rick Joyner has gone to heaven a lot of times, but I haven't been able to do that. But it's going to be an amazing thing. And there's going to be this continuity with so much that's familiar to us, except that it's going to be perfect. And Jesus told his disciples that they should invest their treasure and their time, their very lives in heaven. He told them that they should count the cost, and that whatever the cost, it really is worth it. And Jesus pointed his disciples to heaven for a reason. He wanted to take away their fear of death and the excessive attachment to this world. And for this to happen, we need to become attached to heaven. We need to retrain our hearts. I was on with Cindy Jacobs on her show, and at the end of it, her daughter asked some questions for the audience, and one question was, what do you say to someone who's, in a very difficult situation, they're weary, and what would you advise them? How would you encourage them? So I got to go first, and I say, well, you have to persevere. And when you're in the darkness, persevere some more. And it's miserable, but persevere. Keep persevering, because that's what I had to do, right? So you just, it's not emotions, it's just the will, persevere. And then after that, it's Cindy's turn, and she says, well, I'd encourage them with heaven. I talk about heaven. And I thought, why didn't I say that? She got it right, Is it, to some degree, we have lost the sense of urgency of heaven. The hope, the promise, because we live in the wealthiest country in history. We live in the freest society there's ever been in history. The most powerful country. And there's tremendous comfort. And if you look, there's been tremendous advances in medicine. And if you look, for example, at the songs that came out of slavery, they talked a lot about heaven because their lives here were miserable. There wasn't a lot of hope. And so they're looking toward that promise of heaven. And we've lost that in many ways because we don't sense that same urgency. So here's how I started to retrain my heart. In my second year, I started a discipline of dancing before the Lord for 5 minutes a day. And this is because I became aware that Jesus commanded us to rejoice when we're persecuted. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of things about you on account of me. This is me dancing. You can laugh, that's okay. Rejoice and be glad. And I would leap, rejoice. I rejoice because I'm in prison. Now, don't think that I was feeling any joy. This wasn't from my emotions, but I became aware that Jesus commanded this, and I had not rejoiced. Right. And so, because I love him, because, Jesus said, if you love me, you'll obey my commandments. And I'm saying, I love you. I don't have the emotions, but I'm committed to loving you. One of the ways I'm going to love you is by obeying you and performing an act of rejoicing, even though I have no emotional, the joy isn't there. And so I danced before the Lord for those 5 minutes a day. Now, I leap up and down when I'm saying, I rejoice. Rejoice and be glad, for great is your reward in heaven. Now, I assure you that when I did this, I didn't care about the reward. It's very difficult to be motivated by a far-off reward when I'm suffering and want immediate relief. But I repeated it day after day. I'm rejoicing because great is my reward in heaven. Even if I'm not feeling joy, I'm not motivated by that reward. But something began to change in my inner man. Because again and again I'm saying, I rejoice and I'm glad because great is my reward in heaven. Something began to change inside of me and actually became more focused on heaven and more desirous of being there. So building the right perspective on eternity, on heaven, in the same way I had to build the right perspective on suffering from persecution. I had to learn to suffer. I learned to suffer in prison. There was a book I've been reading, a man named Sylvester Krčmery. He was a medical doctor in Slovakia. And as the communists took over, he was one of the leaders in the underground church. And he expected, because a number of his friends had been in prison, that the police were going to come and get him at some point. So living with that expectation, he prepared himself for the prospect of prison, living every day, repeating every day. He had the thought, there's no higher privilege and no greater joy than being invited to suffer for the sake of Jesus Christ. And he repeats this day after day. He's living with that. If I go to prison, there's no higher privilege. It's a great joy to suffer for Jesus Christ. And then one day the police come and take him, and they put him in prison. And as I look at how he endured the hardships, it goes back to that preparation, that mental preparation, that change of perspective. It's a privilege. It's an honor. It's a joy. Now, when I look at the Chinese, I was talking with one Chinese leader who'd been to prison a couple of times. And she said everyone in her generation, if they became leaders in the church, they knew there was a high likelihood that they would end up spending time in prison. And so they count the cost ahead of time. And they've kind of built that into their expectations. There's also a shared culture of suffering. When your friends have gone to prison and you know that the people after you are going to go to prison for a time, there's a fellowship with other people and sharing. You know, when I see Brother Yoon or Uncle Peter, I immediately just feel a bond with them. Just that we've experienced hardship. We've tasted of bitterness, as some people say. We've tasted the bitterness of suffering. They prepare ahead of time. The younger generation in China hasn't had this yet, but the older generation did. And so I think there's that preparation, that perspective, they build it into their expectation of suffering. I didn't have that. No one had gone to prison in Turkey for their faith and living memory. So I was not at all prepared for this. And I had to learn how to suffer in prison. And one of the ways I did this was, singing those verses from Matthew 5. I rejoice when I'm persecuted. I rejoice when people say all kinds of evil things about me. And just repeating that again and again. Or in my song, I'm singing, you're worthy of my all. My tears and pain I lift up as an offering. Teach me to share in the fellowship of your suffering. I'll share in your glory if I share your suffering. That's from the Bible, by the way. Jesus, you're worthy of us. You're worthy of any suffering I go through. And I'm singing this day after day. That's building that perspective of suffering in me. One prison I was in, it was very cold. It's miserable to be cold. And there was just nothing I could do to warm up. And I cannot do anything to change my circumstances, but I can determine how I'll respond to it. And so I began to say, okay, I don't like being cold, but I embrace this suffering from cold because I want to be able to give it to you, to lay it before you as a sacrifice, as an offering to you out of love for you. So I embrace this suffering. I don't like it, but in a sense, I'm suffering for you, and this gives it meaning. Another prison was very, very hot. It was so hot, I just had a heat rash all over my body for weeks, and it was miserable as well. What do? I say, I don't like, I don't like this heat. I don't like this discomfort, but I embrace it. I choose to suffer for you. I choose to present this to you as a love offering. I choose this suffering. So if I'd done this ahead of time, I would have been better prepared in a sense. But I did it in prison. I learned it there. So we don't know what kind of persecution we're going to face. It's very unhealthy to think about all the terrible things that could happen to you. But we can prepare ourselves with this mentality. If I suffer, there's great worth in it. And as I look back, I talk a lot about my brokenness. I haven't talked about that much today, just my brokenness and weakness, the lack of presence or of God's voice or of any joy. But as I look back, I can see there was sometimes a sweetness in the pain. There was a closeness to Jesus, just a little bit of rejoicing, maybe not the emotion of the joy, but the rejoicing. In He knows what I'm feeling. He knows what I'm going through. He knows my heart. He knows I'm suffering for Him. And this gives me a sense of satisfaction because it's for Him. And a sense of privilege that I can suffer and that I've been counted worthy of suffering for the name. A sense that this suffering has value and meaning and significance that is going to last forever. And it wasn't very often. I don't want you to think that I was just, wow, I feel so joyful. No, it wasn't that. But it was subtle. It was kind of like grace. It didn't cancel the pain. It was in the midst of pain, but it was there. Amen. Just a subtle rejoicing. So I want to go back to my prison song. I'm singing that every day. I want to be found worthy to stand before you on that day with no regrets, some cowardice, things left undone. And then the second part of it, to hear you say, well done, my faithful friend, now enter your reward. Jesus, my joy, you're the prize I'm running for. And as I repeated this day after day, something took root in me. It was just a simple and basic foundational knowing that Jesus is my reward. And as I pressed into this fear of God, on building the right perspective, on looking to heaven, learning to suffer as a privilege, my perspective had changed over the months. It built something in me. Then I was put on trial before the judges, before the media in the courtroom. And this is the result of that building perspective over that year. I say, blessed am I. I'm reading from the court transcripts. This is what I told them. Blessed am I, because for the sake of Jesus, many people have wronged me, have persecuted me, and I'm now suffering. Blessed am I, because I've been forcibly separated from my wife and children. Blessed am I, because I'm in prison. I choose willingly to suffer for the sake of Jesus. And by suffering for His sake, I hope to display for everyone His incomparable worth. Amen. Now, thinking this way didn't make things easy. They sent me right back to prison after I said this. Suffering was still painful. I still felt grief, intense loneliness, the loss of my family, and I still had feelings of fear. But countering this was this conviction, an insistent voice inside me saying, Andrew, you cannot run. There are great and important things at stake. Stand firm. My mother was allowed to visit me early on in my imprisonment, and I was already breaking. I'm sitting across from her, and I'm just crying. And she said, Andrew, there's a long line of people who suffer for Jesus Christ. It's a line that extends 2,000 years. And my son, it is your turn to stand in that line. And I didn't want to hear that. I said, Mom, how about some compassion? I didn't want to hear it because it's a hard truth. But as my imprisonment extended, and I'm thinking, I don't know if I'm ever going to get out. Then I began to look to those who had suffered before me, to Brother Yoon, to Richard Rembrandt, to others. And they were an inspiration for me because they left that example of faithful endurance. And I thought, if they did it, I don't think that I had the strength, but if they did it, then I should be able to as well. And then I'm looking at the people ahead of me, and at some point I become aware there's going to be a line that comes behind me. And I need to leave an example of faithful endurance for them. Some of you may have to stand in that line. I think some of you will stand in that line. And if you do, you're going to be on display. You're going to be on display for other believers because courage is contagious, because they'll look at your example the same way I looked at the example of Brother Yoon. And it's also going to be a display for unbelievers, because when you're willing to suffer for the sake of Jesus Christ, this is a very powerful witness for the gospel. It shows the great worth of Jesus Christ. So I'd say to you, prepare to be on display. Prepare to suffer. And start to work on this now. Ask God to put His fear in your heart so you will not depart from Him. so that you won't give in to the fear of man. I started to do this early on. I did it throughout my entire time in prison. I pursued it. I begged God for that because I knew that I needed it. And declare what is true. My citizenship is in heaven. I'm living for the day I stand before Jesus. Jesus is my reward. It's an honor. It's a privilege to suffer for Jesus. And declare it repeatedly, and you'll begin to believe it. It'll begin to reshape your heart, and you'll live accordingly. Work on developing those eternal lives so you have the right perspective. And count the cost. Determine that you're willing to pay the price. I think Jesus said, stand firm and you will win life. That's in Luke 21. And the context of this verse is so important. In Luke 21, Jesus is warning his disciples, there's going to be violence and wars and pestilence and famine and fearful events. That's pretty bad. And then it gets worse. He says, then he goes into detail on the persecution they'll face. They're going to seize you and persecute you. Even family and friends will betray you. Some will be killed. Everyone will hate you because of me. Jesus, stop encouraging us. No. Everyone's going to hate you. He says, but not a hair of your head will perish. Stand firm and you will win life. When these things begin to take place, stand up and lift up your heads because your redemption is near. Think of all those terrible things he's just mentioned. Then he's saying, stand up and lift up your heads. What he's saying is, as we enter these times of darkness and pressure, stand firm and lift up your head in hope and expectation. And you can only do this if you have a right perspective. Noreen told me, she said, early on, she told me, Andrew, if we go through this the right way, we'll have no regrets. And when she said that, she didn't know if I would be released in this life. She didn't know if I'd get out of prison. But she was saying, Andrew, be faithful. Continue to love God. Go through this the right way. And you'll have no regrets in eternity. So I want to live an expectation of the next billion years. Is that too big a number? An expectation of the next million years. And keep that perspective. I'd like to play the song that I sang in prison. Can we do that? So, this was my love song to Jesus, what I've been talking about now. So, just close your eyes and listen to the words. Holy Spirit, open our eyes to see what we don't see. May we have the perspective of heaven and live with confidence. So I want to pray for you what I prayed for myself many times in prison and for my family. Father God, pour out on your sons and daughters. Pour out on us, your sons and daughters, the courage, the strength, the confidence, the hope, the perseverance, endurance, and steadfastness of Jesus. Pour out on us the Spirit of your Son, that we may run the race set before us and finish well, a beautiful bride, purified in the fires of faithful obedience, tested and found worthy of her beloved, of Jesus, the King of glory. I bless you in the name of my King. Amen.